Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Welcome to this week's edition of the Low Residency MFA in Visual Studies Visiting Guest Artist Lecture Series. Next week is the last week of the Visiting Lecture Series, and on Wednesday will be Claire Fontaine. Same time, same place. There's also a couple of other announcements. Inca Institute, that's the collaborative space run by Alejandro Salinas and I. We have our first opening in Portland this Sunday at 3 p.m. Go to incainstitute.org to see the address and details. And then the graduation show, which is August 4th, come and... Oy. I have no idea. August 2nd, it's going to be fantastic. And Claire Fontaine also has an opening on August 2nd, right, at Williamson Night. So, yeah, come see that. I'm super happy to welcome this week's guest in, but there'll be somebody giving a proper introduction. Joseph?
Emotional support.
Public Display of Professionalism is a research platform based in Miami, co-founded by Domingo Castillo, Patricia M. Hernandez, and Natalia Zuluaga. The projects that PDP undertakes focus on the ways in which image, financial capital, and information flows mobilize master plans, redevelop cities, and hedge on the future. Patricia Margarita Hernandez is a curator based in New York, invested in collaborative art production and research. Patricia's work focuses on climate change, feminist theory, and coastal city development within neoliberal schema. Patricia is also the associate director of Air Gallery, the first woman artist-run cooperative space in the United States. Natalia Zuluaga is currently curator at large at Art Center, South Florida, where she develops a variety of initiatives that bridge contemporary art and other fields. Since 2015, she has co-run Name Publications, nonprofit cultural office, and publishing platforms that develop and support books and public programs by artists, curators, transdisciplinary theorists, designers, and institutions. Her work focuses on developing artistic, curatorial, and pedagogical platforms from which a variety of agents could develop discussions, objections, and questions about climate change, political ecologies, and decolonial thinking. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph.
In the context of climate change annihilation, the growing capacities of automation, and culture's current failure to disrupt contemporary configurations of power, it is clear we need new ways to discern, sense, and navigate within these spatial flows.
Future mining is a methodology that takes into consideration our built environment as the coagulation of complex relations rendered through projections from the future that bear down on the present.
Part A, the setup, a pitch.
The 2008 crash forced contemporary art institutions to restructure their financial dependencies and sources, a process that only exaggerated what had started after economic shifts in the 1970s dried up public funding for the arts and recalibrated those models toward a dependency on corporate sponsorships. In some cases, this led to deinstitutionalization, to work small with small number of participants in situations that involved little money. The modalities that ensued are familiar, at least to us. The freelance curator, programming takeovers by small institutions within larger, more powerful structures, the boom of the artist residency. These operational methods were not just co-opted into larger institutions, they further revealed a strengthened symbolic and reputational marketplace that emerged after 2008. Cash savings and earnings for the institution were exchanged for legitimacy on all sides, for the sponsor, the board member, artist, curator, and institution. Again, we were supposedly reminded that the inside was the outside, and that the possibilities for institutional critique had been foreclosed.
However, other instrumental observations also emerged from this period, that the relationship between contemporary art and the world was not limited by the semantic value it created within art, but instead that this semantic value was actually part of a broader implicated relationship between contemporary art and an era of neoliberal hypercapitalism. Perhaps they were even the same. These events helped us understand how reputational currency functioned like hyper-advertising in fueling real estate speculation and gentrification, and in turn, how this process reflected the financialization of everything, deriving value from contingent profit.
What we want to consider is the following. If the contemporary art condition is imbricated within the neoliberal condition, then we can assume that the institution is a site for restructuring those very conditions because of its proximity. In other words, if we acknowledge that contemporary art institutions are a power actor within global financial markets, followed by an understanding that capital has structured power dynamics well into the future through investments, how then can we simulate these strategies to effect a change that the present demands? What then are the kinds of institutional forms that we want to create and foster in order to alter the conditions of neoliberal capitalism? It's a big question, a potentially paralyzing one. But if the formula is something like contemporary art, institutions made of collective agents, plus economic disparity, hyper-individualism, social inequality equals big bad neoliberal capitalism, then influence and inhabit the formula in order to change the outcome. The following is the beginning of a PDP master plan, localized in Miami in order to situate your global confusion.
Assumption 1. What is an institutional form? A non-exhaustive list of examples: the Kunsthalle, museums, the book, the catalog, a collaboration, self-organized groups, alternative art spaces, artist-run spaces, nomadic everything, art fairs, biennials, symposia, research centers, pedagogical platforms, freelancers, the artists, tradition, canon, criticism, and art education, participation as organizational model, not to be romanticized.
Task 1. Introduce the current state of contemporary art within a Miami setting. Miami is at the crossroads where neoliberal finance and culture intersect. It is a place where you come to party and retire. The next area is always being gentrified. The beaches are usually packed, and the swamp toxifies in the background. A place where development companies buy property, build high-rises, and dictate how the general population moves through the city. Miami is sinking due to sea level rise, yet it is a thriving port city where financial markets flow in and out of the United States. A place where drugs come in, a place where information travels through, an entry into the US for the Caribbean and Latin America. Miami exploits its lifestyle branding through Caribbean flavors, margaritas with cocktail parasols, palm trees, sunsets, high-end shopping, vacation vibes, and relaxation.
Let's summarize. Drug movement, people movement, port movement, real estate speculation, funny money, shadow economies, skeleton coasts.
Palm trees and neon lights, overdoses and face eating, productive contradictions.
Someone once said Miami is only relevant 4 days out of the year. He, a white male curator, both of academic pedigree and economic privilege, was referring to Art Basel Miami Beach. The short-sightedness of this comment shouldn't elicit our emotional responses or the production of a list of justifications. The short-sightedness of this observation is that it fails to recognize how a global contemporary art apparatus functions at a structural and infrastructural level, at city scale, not just gallery scale, and on a temporal range of decades, not just days.
Mind maps. What contemporary art promises: jobs, urban renewal, quick returns on investments, private backing, public subsidies, geopolitical prestige, even nation building is on offer here. Equals contemporary art, Miami Beach, Art Basel, tourist development, million-dollar art, water main upgrades, luxury districts of design, transportation improvements, water pumps, capital campaigns, starchitects, content generators, research centers.
Master plans build horizons of technological innovation, shopping centers, new hearts, reimagined spaces. Miami is a presentation for an investment portfolio in a drowned future that doesn't need to happen in order to actualize a profitable now. Can you think of other places where the imminent threat of effects on climate change only fuels the need to buy now? Probably. Enter Miami, or any global city.
In this way, the idea that Miami is only relevant for 4 days just proves how Miami, in brackets, is the paradigm of a globalized relationship between contemporary art and economic development. And as such, Miami, in brackets, or any global city, becomes relevant precisely because it localizes a global condition and is an ideal site for a project of agency and traction that creates a shift away and a pivot out of dominant oppressive conditions.
Part B. Enter PLP/PDP. Assumption 2. Opacity in contemporary art as it relates to power structures within it. Semantic value, i.e., theory, the magical meaning of art, abstraction from material realities, invites and fosters a reputational economy where reputational currencies are cached in for cash.
Task 2. Define PDP-PLP. PLP, palapinga, a mode of operating with disregard to structural limits and ceilings, but with a strategic intent to instrumentalize those limits. It's defined more by fuck it. It's Miami's way of deprofessionalization. It's that moment where you just want to stop working, enjoy the beach, have a mojito, enjoy the sun, or at least all of that fake sand at Sandbar. It's the pill that makes having agency, and here, insert your own neoliberal struggle, possible.
POP is the anti-paralysis moment in the face of overwhelming complexity.
PDP, public display of professionalism, that is the demand to act and produce culture for every institution in Assumption 1.
Part C, Master Planning. In order to create a master plan, political economies are organized in qualitative categories. For example, jobs, housing, economic equality, democratic ideals. The master plan is thus a horizon that is rendered from the relationship between social feedback and political power. A master plan for a city is drawn out, say 50 years ahead, as a horizon, and the political, social, private, public energies are vectorized toward the closest realization of that horizon. As explained above, what matters in the now is not those 4 days. What matters in the now is actually racial injustice, economic disparity, climate change, etc. What happens in the future is already determining that those things in the now remain the same. The master plan doesn't need to figure out every step until then. The master plan, the PLP plan, instrumentalizes the PDP and vice versa. In order to exit from their contemporary art political trajectories and enter into a poignant mode of operating.
Hype. Circulation and distribution of an image. In this case, we're using Miami in brackets as a stand-in for any developing neoliberal city, which is a global phenomenon. What is understood here is that the sunset, the beaches, relaxed tropicality, it sells. With its close proximity to exotic islands, Miami uses hype to garner more investments, tourism, or the next pyramid scheme. This is the PLP, documented, packaged, and sold.
Action. Appropriation of a think tank model. Focus on how contemporary art can shift into a mode of strategic planning that mimics financial capital. Financial and real estate power players have the next 30 to 50 years planned. The future literally is dictating the present. PLP, PDP does not want to judiciously study the effects of neoliberal right-wing conditions or its futures. It wants to harness the tools, the strategies, establish the operations in order to act in a way that redirects, recalibrates, and sets the conditions of how power is played in the PDP. Calling out soft politics of benevolent lefty concerns in the contemporary art that are being utilized by capital returns on investments, money laundering, city development, and tourism. PLP exploits them to other ends.
Our example. Learn how to use the publicity machine. Learn how it works. Collectivize. Create the image. Instrumentalize it by circulating it. Cache in on it. Open the forum to challenge and create new forms. Inhabit infrastructures and recreate imaginaries. Before you know it, a new institutional form has emerged.
All right.
So Before we kind of go into talking a little bit about what this all is, what it means, and really who we are, I think we'd be obviously remiss if we really didn't thank our hosts. Thank you, Aaron Bergman, Alejandra Salinas, Aaron Dengerig, I think I got that right, our MFA cohort who we've been spending such a nice, wonderful days with. Really, it's been a very warm welcome to both like us as people and to our ideas. Also, we want to thank Ben and Danny up there who have kind of stayed with us this whole afternoon, tweaking things around. I have to say that when this invitation first came by, it was a really good opportunity to think about what had been a very short collaborative project at that moment for PDP. And so it was a good opportunity to think and to talk about it. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit more, but we hope you guys have some questions because we don't want to spend the entire time talking. And then we'll go from there. So Patty, tell everybody what PDP is.
So, Public Display of Professionalism is a research platform that really began as three people, three friends, speaking through the complexity of the network relations within a neoliberal city and the role contemporary art play within it. And really, it's a way out of our supposed progressive and liberal ideas, and to do a little more than just hashtag political concerns. For us, it was a way in which we can imagine new formations to tackle these problems, but we realized that we needed to make a complex map of abstract relations and then talk about them.
So it's kind of hard because Patty and I and our colleague Domingo, who's in Miami, are kind of these very weird hybrid forms of practitioners. We are kind of curators. We kind of sometimes do artist things, so we're a little bit of both. So when people ask, well, what is it that you do? We research really slowly, basically. We write when we can. We keep our eyes open on a lot of things. And for the most part, we share a lot of Google Docs and fill a lot of drives with a lot of images and information that just kind of sticks to us. And then we spend a lot of time talking about them. So we don't produce a lot in terms of what you would call public tangible things, but we do think together a lot. We discuss, we try to disentangle things, and then for us, that is the production. We understand that that is the labor that is unseen, and eventually it finds its way into public forms, right? But it needs that time to cook. We like to think, I guess, in that way that we're not necessarily pressured by the demands of production. And if you heard us talking a few minutes ago, if we're starting to think about a kind of practice that thinks through a master plan methodology of 30 years ahead, we're well, 5 years of research is going to be nothing in the course of those 30 years. So we do a lot of that too.
And the text we just read to you was the first thing we did together as a collective. It was a response to a commission in 2016 that asked us to reflect on institutional forms. And at the time, the three of us were pretty frustrated, to say the least, about our ability to penetrate and intervene upon what we felt was the art real estate machine that was eating us alive and really eating our surroundings alive. And then really, it's for us on the East Coast, there's Miami, then there's seeing something like New York and how that kind of booms within months. Cities and areas in New York have a tendency to just shift. And in Miami, where we were and where we were situated in, we were able to kind of see these neighborhoods develop. Within 15 years, we saw the kind of really this relationship between culture and real estate development really shift the area, and it was a way that was so palpable and so visceral, and there was nothing we could do about it because we would get a subsidized art rent, subsidized rent or whatever. And of course, what are you going to say no to cheaper rent? No, you go. But what do you do when you're being utilized by this huge thing? Yeah.
So I just want to say before you continue,
Yeah.
that experience of seeing the city change wasn't a story that they told you about, the Lower East Side was inhabited by artists. It was not happening over the course of 30 years. It was Literally, you saw the plan in the Miami Herald, and within 5 years, the entire neighborhood was completely different. So this was something else had happened that allowed this process to basically accelerate really fast.
Yeah, and then just another quick little antidote. There was a real estate developer, Goldman Properties. They developed Soho in New York. They went on to develop Ocean Drive in South Beach. And then they went on to develop Northwest 2nd, which is now Miami's Wynwood, which is like the arts district. And I saw a representative from that company speak, and he showed renderings and specifically stated the company's 100-year plan for this area. And we've seen it. Like, I've seen it happen. Like, what he spoke about in the past eventually happened in my present. And I think for me and for us, that really struck us and put us in a position to force us to imagine what were the terms that we wanted to set on our complicity within Miami's arts system. Now, this is like a bit tricky because, what was understood Miami as being, we understood that Miami was like one example of a global city, essentially a factory phenomenon. And so this text, going back to the text, situated Miami in what was intended to be spoken to other practitioners within the global contemporary ecology. Hence, the use of brackets are really important for us in the text, as it calls any of us, all of us, to kind of fill in the blanks.
So you may be asking yourself, like we did when we finished it, like what is it about and really kind of what does it do? And I think the easiest thing is to really think about the kind of images that it uses. So all of the images in there are literally mined from architectural renderings and advertising in Miami. These are images that we collage, we keep as is, we intervene upon by adding text, but for the most part, we kind of don't have to do a lot. There's a lot of art already in there, and they're pretty effective images, right? They're used to sell property that then goes on to do something quite physical. So we kind of figured that of this sort of master plan thinking, there was somebody already there that had done part of our job for us. So the work itself, or this kind of what was initially a text, and this is the first time that we've actually thought about this as part of a public lecture, is really about the intersection between real estate development and contemporary art ecology. And when we say ecology, we kind of really mean like the contemporary art village, right? So it's every practitioner, it's every artist, it's every institution, it's everything that kind of makes that ecology both a closed system and one that is connected to other systems, right? It needs to survive somehow, and its food is found both within and outside. So we kind of use that bioterm in order to refer to it. So in realizing that really that proximity to real estate, the connection between those things, kind of implied a proximity to the nexus of power. And that was a question that we kind of really wanted to delve into deeper. So the text, if you also noticed, it also thinks about or talks about these long circuits or temporal circuits. And this meant going back to asking ourselves, what does it mean to have a master plan methodology? Like Patty was just saying, to sit in a presentation where a corporation is talking about its 100-year plan. It's like in all of our art education and practice, nobody had ever talked to us about thinking about things 100 years in that way. They had told us think about the world, it will end in 500 years, but it had never really thought about a strategic practice within those arcs. And that was really fascinating for us. For us, it wasn't about a constant presentism. It's also really important to note that at the time of writing this, we were really immersed in you don't have to know what it means actually, but we were really immersed in these discourses about accelerationist politics. We were really trying to find our grounding, and we found that there was nobody that, let's just say, looked like us. There was very few women in that discourse. There were very few people from Latinx backgrounds in that discourse. And we but we really felt like we had something, perhaps a nuanced position to speak of, that people in New York or in London in those academic circles maybe had a different experience. And it was really worth talking from our position.
And really, this permeates our method of working, our way of looking at power, and the way in which belief systems, the good to the discriminatory and foreclosing, are formed and naturalized. The use of brackets is to underscore the notion that any developing global city could be inserted. It moves from the particular to the global. Please insert your city here. The neoliberal city has and continues to be ubiquitously developed at speeds that defy nature. So, caché in Spanish is similar to the definition of the word cachet.
We think.
Oh, I think. A state of being respected, admired, or to have clout. To say in Spanish, tiene un caché millonario, means, and it's kind of like a funny saying that, you know, people kind of like dismiss somebody with, tiene un caché millonario, means to carry the clout and elegance of a millionaire without the capital to match it.
So when we look at those architectural renderings, we kind of think of them as cachet, right? They're like totally carrying the clout, and they have millions behind them, so like it's not that they don't, but they're carrying that clout, and they're basically like faking it till they're making it, right? And so there was a really easy parallel for us to think about contemporary art as well, right? We were looking at a system that did not tell us a very transparent list of what it meant to be a good, effective artist or curator. It was like, why does one person make it and the other one doesn't? Like, you cannot figure out what the reason is because the rules are completely behind, like, opaque, like opacity. Instead, so we were like, something is happening here. It's actually built on a reputational economy. You collect reputational tokens, right? The more visibility you get, the better chances you have of moving on and sort of like climbing that game. And we really saw a parallel between those two things. So we were just like, okay, this isn't figuring it out. We don't have the answer to it, but we did see that there was something quite connected in that.
So this text, in many ways, is a guiding and evolving document for our research and outputs. It helps us think through the long temporal circuits of our interests. Thinking about the future kind of implies thinking about something like deep uncertainty, and what we're referring to as future mining, and how the master plan methodology relates to all of this.
So I'm going to rehearse a little bit of what we went through because, you know, thinking about things like master plans and future mining seems like also kind of big ideas that are set, like you just said, in like deep uncertainty and deepness. So we said above or earlier, in order to create a master plan, political economies are organized in qualitative categories. So improvement equals jobs, housing, economic equality, all of these good progressive ideals that we have. The master plan is then a horizon, right? It's set over there, that is rendered from the relationship between the social feedback and political power. That's us and them, right? Or like us and power. So constantly in this relationship. A master plan for a city is drawn out. It really is. And it's actually probably between 10 and 50 years in actuality as a horizon. And all of the political, the social, the private, the public energies are vectorized toward the closest realization of that horizon. So it's not like the exact horizon comes into being, but like the present constantly recalibrates and changes itself toward that moment. So how do they do this? And this is total part of what's great about being sort of an artistic practitioner, that you can just guess, right? Is that we estimate that first an image is created. That image generates a fiction, a kind of index or representation of the future. But that future is not so innocent. And it's really because that fiction, or I'm sorry, it's that fiction that's not so innocent. It's really because that fiction is capable of attracting all kinds of investment. And that's political investment, that's social investment, that's economic investment, that's affective investment, right? Like you're looking at those images and they look slick, they look good. That's part of their affective quality to you. And in doing so, they kind of start carving out reality. Theoretical geographer Nigel Thrift said that neoliberalism and all of its manifested forms are like roving empiricisms. And I've always really liked this thing because it implies both movement and like constant movement and constant practicalities. They constantly leverage space and time to satisfy their ends. So it's like both things at the same time. In that way, these things physically bring reality into being. And so when we look back at what they are, they're actually generative fictions.
And this is why we're interested in working with these images. We're trying to short circuit them, reverse engineer them to see what other outcomes can emerge. neoliberal capitalist is allowed to generate these fictions to structure society. Master plans are a way of mining the future. As we mentioned yesterday in the seminar, debt is a form of mining the future. It is a form that restructures the limits of our present as well as foreclosing the percentage of our future. We are really motivated essentially by this idea because there's a preconceived notion that art is always about this present, it's about the formal, and even attempts to act in the social. So to think about the temporal arc of 10 to 50 years felt like a reasonable place to start.
And that start actually meant that we had to first learn how to recognize or how to be able to see, how to read, right? What those dominant patriarchal structures look like and how they morph over time. So that's why we were saying that we research slowly, because it actually takes time to look at these images to sort of see it. And for us, at least, they don't get old every time we look at them. Each one of them sort of imagines a new corner of our city in a different way. You know, capitalism, the big bad C, in a sense, will always subsume what goes against it. It will always position those of us, and I mean everyone, right, in the margins, which is a non-exhaustive list of being poor, of being black, of being brown, of being LGBTQ, all of it, to basically position us against each other. So for who do these master plans serve? Who does our master plan serve? The thing about the master plan that we've sort of thought about as a form is that it really depends. It's not a form, and we talked about this in the seminar yesterday, that's inherently good. It's not one that's inherently bad, but what we found that it's actually inherently effective. And that's really what was really interesting. It's a very effective way to actualize futures by using the present and the future in tandem. So very loosely, our version of future mining uses the freedom of art, so it's these spaces, the ability to actually do this, to create other channels of action and actually schism those dominant theoretical narratives. But there's a problem.
There's always a problem, right? So I'm going to quote Audre Lorde here. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. So really, it's like we're questioning our own methodology. We question whether the replication of power although it may be effective, it's extremely problematic. But also the denial of it is equally as dangerous. So what we know now is that the right has mobilized, strategized, and has backlashed in ways we never thought were possible. And I feel like this will continue to always happen. And we just have to constantly test what the other possibilities are. And part of this like generative fiction is in that, right? I mean, it's like science fiction. It's trying to imagine what is not even possible relative to like maybe technological advances. I think that's partially why climate change is something very important and of interest to our research.
So this is, I feel like the end is always a list of disclaimers and caveats. But like, you know, we are a research platform, and we're not out there protesting. We recognize that. We're not hacking systems. We're actually not scholars. You might have noticed by the looseness of our words. We realize that like there are maybe not enough, but at least some good actors out there doing that. But for us, it's actually equally important to complement those efforts through our artistic research, which is a hybrid manifestation of our curatorial and artistic practices. And this brings up a conversation actually that we had with Aaron yesterday when we were walking, that like the right, or let's just say other kind of political groupings, use things like think tanks, right, to mobilize and to become activists for their causes. And the think tank as a model, just because it's something that we refer to, is actually a way of legitimizing intellectual thought within political beliefs, right? They establish belief systems, and they actually develop them through like a lot of this kind of work. So it's also a reminder to us that the research, that the thinking and the looking is also just as important as the hacking, as the protesting, because all of those things have to happen at the same time. They kind of have to endure more and just as much as the very system that you're kind of going against. So, temporality is a big thing here, and what we mean by temporality is obviously this sort of future structuring the present moment. For us, at least, we always kind of think about this idea of like, well, what our aims and goals are for the future aren't just like these empty holes in the future and like this other space, but we're also constantly vectorizing ourselves and our actions toward it. So like time is a really important component of what we do. So an example, a really bad one, but I'm kidding, a very mean one.
So what does master planning look like in the face of climate change annihilation?
Very happy thoughts, always,
Super,
you guys.
always, yeah. Our response as a master plan addresses the design period, the designated period that industrialism, technological progress set in motion, in which the human imprint can no longer be removed. So it is the process that is no longer confined by numbers and algorithmic formulas, and is made visible through intensifying disasters, earthquakes, fires, and typhoons.
So if this text was a form of like thinking or like, let's say, proclaiming that we were like entering or embarking on a master plan kind of methodology, we were trying to come up with a good example for everybody to understand how it may function. And speaking of things that you draft in public, which may not always work, we wanted to show you this. So we're thinking that the master plan kind of works like the Doomsday Clock. So it articulates a finite and end, right? It's a device that we can test, adjust, and return to every time we're close to that horizon. In order to end this, actually, we hope that you kind of can give us a few more minutes of your time, because we want to show you, telling you how it works and how it was developed is probably not as good as this great video that does. Oh, we got to go to the beginning.
Mm-hmm. This is the Doomsday Clock. It was designed back in 1947 by artist Marta Langsdorff, and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists sets the clock to show how much time we have left until midnight. Midnight in this case meaning nuclear Armageddon and the end of humanity. In January 2017, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists revealed that the clock ticked 30 seconds closer than last year to the end of times, and cited, among other things, climate change, cybersecurity, nuclear weapons, and Donald Trump as causes. At the announcement, Executive Director of the Bulletin, Rachel Bronson, said there were two concerns that stood above the rest.
The first has been the cavalier and reckless language used across the globe, especially in the United States during the presidential election and after. And the second is a growing disregard of scientific expertise.
Cold War and world conflict have influenced the clock's time over the years, but disregard for scientific expertise by global populist leaders, including an American president, has never been cited as a doomsday factor. That said, the newest changes to the clock are the smallest in its history, meaning doomsday, thankfully, isn't necessarily any more imminent. So how accurate is the doomsday clock? And why was it made in the first place? The doomsday clock first debuted in 1947 as a graphic on the cover of the first edition of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists magazine. Artist Marta Langsdorff was married to Alexander Langsdorff Jr., a Manhattan Project scientist. Langsdorff and other concerned scientists founded the Bulletin 2 years prior, feeling a responsibility to warn and educate the public about the possibly disastrous consequences of their creations. Atomic bombs had been used for the first time in 1945, killing 130,000 residents of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Initially, the time on the clock depicted the hour hand pointing straight at the 0 hour, with the minute hand placed at just 7 minutes before midnight. The time was completely arbitrary, though. Langsdorff just thought it seemed the right time. The graphic quickly adopted the name of the Doomsday Clock, and eventually gained world recognition as a symbol for the threat of an impending nuclear apocalypse. Since 1947, the Bulletin has regularly adjusted the clock face when they perceive a change in threat level, also taking into account other non-nuclear factors like climate change, bioweapons, and cyber threats. Doomsday seems just a few ticks away now, but time on this clock doesn't really reflect actual time, nor is it particularly linear. In 1949, the bulletin set the clock to 3 minutes until midnight due to Soviet Union nuclear testing,
Truman's dramatic announcement that Russia had the atom secret.
and to 2 minutes until midnight in 1953, thanks to the US developing the hydrogen bomb. But a decade later, the clock turned back to 12 minutes before midnight, thanks to the US and Soviet Union ending atmospheric nuclear testing.
A milestone in 63. East and West banned the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere.
The minute hand has continued to fluctuate through a range of minutes before midnight since then, from 7 minutes till in 1968 thanks to Vietnam, to 10 minutes till in 1972 at the signing of the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty.
This is not an agreement which guarantees that there will be no war. But what this is the beginning of a process that is enormously important.
To 3 minutes till in 1984 thanks to the heightened tensions between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
None of the 4 wars in my lifetime came about because we were too strong. It is weakness that invites adventurous adversaries to make mistaken judgments.
And all the way back to 17 minutes till in 1991, after the end of the Cold War and the signing of START, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty.
Whether about issues on which we agreed or disagreed, the spirit of candor and openness, a desire not just to understand, but to build bridges, shone through.
In every case, dangerous or potentially dangerous events dictated whether the minute hand moved closer to or away from doomsday. But 2017 is the first time since the Cold War that the bulletin expressed deep concern about the disposition of an American president towards science and nuclear weapons.
So you don't want to say take everything off the table. No, just nuclear. You're a negotiator if you do. Just nuclear. Look, nuclear should be off the table. But would there be a time when it could be used? Possibly. Okay,
No.
Even though the outlook seems grim, it's important to remember what the time on the clock is really meant to show. It's not doomsday yet, and on this clock, we can turn back time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we welcome any of your questions and if comments, concerns, complete disagreements.
Confusions. Or you can let us off the hook.
Oh my gosh, even better.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a big one, right? But how, I think the question is how you mobilize a kind of collective conscious to do that, right? So like that, like how do you convince a mass group of people to reshift their money, like not just temporarily where you're just asking. So I'm thinking of like boycotts, right? Or you like boycott a corporation, stop doing that, and they temporarily stop what they're doing, right? But the thing about like neoliberalism and capitalism is that it responds very quickly. Right? And so it finds the next hole to go. And so you got to go basically play whack-a-mole with it and do that over and over again until you've basically gotten rid of every single like like all of it together at once. And that seems really like that. I think that was your particular kind of response was like one of the starting points. It was just like, wow, but it just feels so paralyzing. Like it just seems so difficult. And so it's like, all right, well, the question is like, where do you start? So yeah, I agree that could be done. Yeah. Bob?
What would you imagine a think tank would look like, and how would you put it together?
I know.
Not the answer, but think it out.
Okay, so thinking it out. Well, we would definitely be in it. And I think, so Keller Easterling speaks about, in her text Medium Design, she speaks about a certain like multidisciplinary thinking or acting and doing things in a different way. Partially because how we started the talk, which is feeling that there's currently, we feel that culture has failed to kind of create a counter narrative, or this counter narrative that's constantly being created is constantly being subsumed. And so Kelly Easterling calls for like a different use of space or different configurations of space. So I think for us, a think tank would look in a way partially much like they look like now, which is people from various disciplines coming together and having depending on what we're working out, but let's say a master plan. I think a big thing for us would be that it would be practitioners not necessarily in the United States.
Right, not alone.
Yeah.
You know, the other thing about that, when we've thought about it, because sometimes when we do either like seminars somewhere or like we talk to other colleagues, like you kind of get really excited and you all want to like start one together, and then that network kind of grows. So that's one way where it sort of emerges, naturally. But then the other important thing that I always think about is that it's really, for us at least, really important not to just stay within our own circles. So, you know, we don't just talk to other artists and we don't just talk to other curators, at least in our practice. Like, you know, like I was telling you today, we talk to we're within proximity of collectors, we're in proximity of people. So the thing is that you have to, for a think tank, I think, talk to people at different levels of power, right, and of interest, and sort of coalesce around a cause. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's like something that we kind of sketch through all the time. The thing about the think tank, for me at least, is, and I think Patty, you would probably agree, is that it's like, it's kind of about like still maintaining the importance of this kind of like thinking, that like thinking is actually really important. The value of like intellectual thought actually is at the very root of creating belief systems. And we forget that when they tell you that like the right is just a simplistic sort of media machine, it's actually not, right? It's actually a highly complex, very thought out, like deeply ingrained, very smart, intelligent form of activism. And so I think that that's the thing that sometimes people don't like to hear, because they don't like to hear the word activism associated with those things, but they're very effective activists. So, and part of that is that. Oh. Mm-hmm.
Because you guys mentioned, and I think this is the ambiguity in what you're talking about with bringing up the Audre word at the end, you know,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the kind of dichotomy between mimicry and, you know, the fact that you can't really use the master's tools, you know, to really subvert in a certain way, or that it's inherently problematic project. But so with this concept or idea of future mining, I mean, I think future mining is the logic of debt, right? I mean, it is like the central logic of neoliberalism, and it structures subjectivity in a particular way, and that, you know, our futures, that we relate to the future in terms of an extractive logic,
right?
That the future is seen as something that mines the present for capital, essentially, right? But also our imagination, our mind. And so when you were talking about that concept, you were kind of saying, like, we don't necessarily think this is inherently like bad or good.
Master planning isn't.
Master planning. So that's not future. So when you're talking about future mining, that wasn't.
So no, I don't know if this completes your question, but the future mining aspect of it, it's like we use it as a term because you have to talk about the bad of it in order to talk about the constructiveness that's possible in the sort of construction of a future, right? So yeah.
And this is where my question was. Because I see that same ambiguity.
Yeah, totally.
Future mining, because you are looking for a constructive aspect.
Right.
But to me, it's like the very idea of like mining. I mean, we're thinking about a relationship between, we're talking about temporality and the relationship between future and present, right? I mean, inherently, I think that we're looking for a subversive logic to neoliberalism. It's not a logic of mining.
Right, because you're thinking about it from extractive points of view, right? So the reason that we use mining, and I actually totally agree with you, and I think that that's the sort of the problematic that we run into, and also, let's say, the terminology of things, but it's also that, like, we're thinking about the expansive potential of the future, right? And, like, we're not thinking about foreclosing and on, like, mining and extracting, like, things that, like, you may need, right? But that we're thinking about extracting possibilities from those potentials. And so, like, mining is a really ugly word, right? But I think that that's also kind of the reason why we like to use it, because it sort of produces this image of like grabbing from this other future that's all like that's being mined in other ways, like in debt ways, and that way to sort of say like, okay, well, there must be also good opportunities. There are utopias. There are things that are like realizable that can be mined to construct the present. So they're not like extractive to eliminate. And I agree. I think that that's sort of a problem that we run into. But at least in the formulation of how we think through it, it's like that there's like infinite good that can be extracted or like used from the future to construct the present, right? And if everybody is if the future is constructing the present, then it's like it feels like our present is foreclosed, right? And that's at least how we think about it. So it's like, okay, for lack of a better science fiction reference, that, the battle is there, kind of thinking. I agree. It creates sort of a problem of rhetoric.
Yeah, but I wonder if it creates more than a problem of rhetoric, a problem of political strategy or aesthetic strategy too, because so long as we're thinking about that relationship as being one of extraction of anything, right? But one of that has the potential of problematizing even these utopian contexts.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, cryptocurrencies are kind of bad mining. But no, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think. So that's definitely like the hopeful use of it. Although I don't think we don't think about it through like the idea of like crypto mining of that. But I do agree that it creates like that it's sort of maybe like a big hurdle that we create for the concept itself, or like it brings up an interesting sort of question and challenge for us. But like this is kind of like we were thinking about a word or a concept that was kind of ambiguous in that sense, right? For starters, yeah. Yes. I'm gonna write that down for. There's a group of 3 of us. It's a very democratic process. There's a review panel. No, but I agree. Yeah. Speaking of image making, right? So the whole idea of mining itself sort of creates the antithesis of the image that we're going for. So I think that's also really interesting. I see a hand.
I didn't have this reaction to mining, but I certainly had a similar reaction to master plan.
How funny.
I'm kind of trying to think through, like I think some of it's from working in small arts nonprofits, where there becomes an obligation to funders and an expectation that the nonprofit, which might be very grassroots artist run, develop strategic plans, which are certainly expected of museums, and 5-year plans and 10-year plans, and the idea that these need to be published and look beautiful and very formal and signed up on the board, and kind of resistance within those organizations that that's completely antithetical to the way the organization should work, that it goes against the sort of organic nature of it, and also that those models are being imposed from from funders and board members who are coming from capitalist backgrounds, and that they're always linked to a strategy of growth. The reason you develop strategic plans is to like outline a percentage of growth over years. So strategic plan is different than a master plan, but it certainly evokes for me something that I would rather keep far away from art. But the other thing is this master plan is just kind of like inherently sort of evil, and like I have my master plan. Like somehow it ignores the marginal and the subtleties and the contradictions. It's hard to buy onto a master plan and then reroute. That's the whole nature of it. The master plan exists, you're on board and you're going and forget what happens. So it kind of like it definitely made me uneasy in a certain way.
I love that. Do you have something? I mean, there's a lot to say.
There is a lot to say. I'll start with like, I think it's within that zone of being really uncomfortable that we're sitting in. And when you look up master plan, and especially in which the way cities use them and the way they word, like the language within these plans, every city has them. You can look them up. They're usually published online. And you really begin to see how these group of people, who I will not begin to say who I believe and think they are, how these group of people lay out the plan for the city and how they presume to have everybody's intention in mind, right? And then you see that master plan and how it actually really unfolds. Then there's, I also work for a nonprofit and I'm familiar
So
with,
do I.
I'm familiar with that too. And grant and that type of funding is hugely problematic, and very taxing on a usually very small staff organization. So yeah, I can totally understand why something like this would just kind of be like, oh, I just can't. But partially it's like what's important for us is in researching this type of tool and how it's implemented, because I do believe that the people who are dictating the future is affecting our present. And for us, it's like this question really began in trying to unpack that with all its like, with all of it, from a position, from a position of trying to see if there was a way that we can implement that in a different way, you know, like how can we restructure a future that's different than what's been happening. I mean, the other thing is like another position that we were coming from was there's the problem, for example, that museums will have these exhibitions or will have these talks that are extremely like socialist, left, these like very concerns for the people, and the artwork that, it's like a communist artwork or those type of like mind frame. And then really you're sitting in a museum in a huge position of power within the arts and money and culture and the way in which the museum's positioned in that. And for us, there's a disjuncture there. There's something that doesn't seem as authentic as it's presenting itself to be. And I think that's where, what we're trying to see is how the museum can, or not just the museum, really, it's like an institution, which we have, as you saw, there was a list of them, but where we can kind of shift a conversation or create another schism or whatever.
Yeah, I was thinking actually, and I'm glad that you mentioned the word authenticity. And actually, so the whole thing that you're talking about, like strategic plans, master planning, like sort of like this deviant sort of powerhouse thing, which is uncomfortable because it's sort of the villainous aspect of it. I think, at least for us, and I won't speak for, art education everywhere, but like Patty and I were educated at universities that weren't so great. Initially, we went off to be quite fortunate to, get good programs later on in our graduate education. But until then, sort of like the idea of being an artist was like supposed to be very uncomfortable with power, right? It was like supposed to actually reject those very ideas and those proximities of like money and all of that because it made you less authentic. So like being, authentic, we weren't, and I still think we're trying to figure that out of like, are we more authentically artistic? Like, if we reject this, like, are those two really do they have to be coupled in that way? And so we continue to be quite, uncomfortable with like the whole. Although I think the villainous thing could be kind of fun, but not permanently. But I think that there's something about like that the moment you start talking about power, art doesn't belong there. But then when you think about its proximity to power and where those boards lie, that's a really crappy thing to give up, right? Like that's a really crappy sort of bit of agency to say like I want nothing to do with. So that sort of they become sort of the hard task of like the people who want to say like, well, maybe the kind of master plan I'm thinking about doesn't involve grant writing. So we're taking suggestions. But thank you for that. That's it. Oh, Abney.
This might be way off topic.
No.
But I think about, as you're talking about future mining, I have an interest in mythology, and then watching the Doomsday Clock, I can't help but think of how like so many mythological traditions, spiritual traditions, especially the dominant Western tradition, has this apocalyptic end, which like to some degree you can think of like the writing of that myth
Totally.
So I'm interested in like how that has shaped consciousness, and and I've always thought of like that being an obstacle to progress, because a lot of people believe that, oh, God has a plan, so I can't do anything because it doesn't matter because there's this greater power that has this plan. So I guess I'm interested, like I think artists have the power of rewriting myth and dictating myth. So I'm curious, like if you see any connection between mythology and the things you're talking about outside of capitalist agenda.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about making images, right? Too, right? And like reading them. So I mean, I'm really glad that you brought this up, because actually the very same, I think Patty Domingo and I, if we accidentally say the word new, it's not because we mean it. Like, we're not really thinking that we're talking about something or new sort of way of thinking, but actually myth making works very similar, right? It's like belief making, all of that. And I think you're pointing to very similar strategies with different technologies, right? That like happen in different ways. So yeah, I mean, I think the very sort of studying how an image generates reality is part of creating that myth. Yeah, I'm actually glad we brought that up. Yeah.
I think if you put the picture out there enough, over and over and over again, then it sticks in people's minds, and then things start to move in that direction. So you showed all these images, and they're just kind of like these like penthouses in Miami. Now, I mean, I'm still trying to figure out why you're showing us penthouses in Miami.
Because we're hoping you're listening to us and what we're saying about it too. So, I think, sorry, I don't know.
No, you could go ahead and then I'll interject.
Yeah. That it works very differently when we first published this text, I think, because we didn't have an opportunity to show all of these as examples. So like, they're supposed to go in tandem with what we're saying. Like, don't go buy those condos, please.
No, and I'm also
Forrest.
No, and I'm also gonna pull out like, so these images are used to sell property that is shifting the landscape of Miami in multiple ways. In the sense that Miami is not a huge city, but that especially where these condos are situated in, they're situated on the water in areas that are going to sink. So already there, that's like something very interesting happening there, and and most of them aren't filled up. They're also taking over. So downtown Miami did not have like an activated city center for, I can't even tell you for how long. Maybe at one point it had like a little bit of a boom, and then it died out, and the city center was dead. So how do you activate a city center? You bring in the culture, whatever it goes, condos go up, and people like, the gentrification happens. People get pushed out. And that's like, and these areas, this is exactly what's happening throughout these areas. So these images are being used to sell property that hasn't, like buildings that haven't even started to be built yet. So that's where that's kind of the position in which we're functioning. Investment properties, most of them. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Enter brackets. Yeah. And what do you do, right?
I definitely love the idea of the brackets, because the more I travel, the more I see this everywhere, right? But especially, I was born here, and even though the story is different, we're not sinking necessarily. We're constantly seeing buildings come up. I see neighborhoods that, Northeast Portland is now where everybody who wants to have a certain lifestyle lives. That used to be like all, other races and low rundown houses, cheap,
Yeah. We heard.
Yeah.
That's I mean, to know the thing about protest, and, I'm like a supporter of all of my, friends and colleagues and cohort who go out there and, and put the physical and actual present energy into doing it. But I think collaborate, like other people who are doing our kinds of practice, it's also important because then the hope is that people go out and next time they see one of these architectural renderings or next time they see the building, so they may not think, the image that comes to mind may not be of the protesters sort of picketing, right? But they're sort of like thinking about like what that image actually is. And I think that there's something different that happens in that like parallax shift at that moment. And it doesn't happen every time, right? It's not a guarantee that it happens, but it is kind of part of how like we walk around our city too and think about it, I guess. Did I see another hand? Was there a ghost hand out there? No. Phantom hands. Bob's hand.
How about looking at the counter plan? Come up with a counter plan based on another concept other than real estate, but a counter plan based on transportation. Transportation that enables all socioeconomic groups to come to the glossy beach to serve the community, because that's what the gloss is looking for, but also creating other kinds of environments, parks, recreation areas, shopping areas that then are based on a corridor, because you have an interstate highway, actually two of them. You got the toll road, and then you got the other one that's jam-packed. You need better infrastructure. So if you overlay an improved transportation system with maybe a rapid train down the middle from you-know-who, that might be another way to get money attracted to you to say, hey, why don't you work on that? We'll give you some money and you develop that. So that'll be another way you could use the neoliberal bank to support another way of balancing out communities, so you're raising everybody at the same time, not just protesting.
Yeah, that's actually a really great thing you brought up, because in the master plan, something like transportation is a huge section, and it's definitely there. And at some point, maybe we will address that.
A personal anecdote, my partner is a civil engineer that works in transportation. So the very challenge that you're talking about is one that within their own field, like they're confronted with tons of challenges and 4-year election cycles and funding, right? So, the idea of mobilizing power toward those changes is not, I think that that's why within each one of these fields, it's really kind of important to like talk through these things and confront them, because it's like every time his optimism lulls for that potential, right? It's like he's surrounded. That's why it's really important to sort of surround yourself also with different people. He surrounds himself with people like us who are kind of like these like raspy, sandy optimists, right? Like pes optimists. And so, yeah, to just say that like they have issues too.
I don't think we'd be sitting here if we didn't have some sort of hope, right? And we wouldn't be thinking through possibilities if we didn't believe that another possibility could happen. I think what shifts is the relationship to time. It's not that you'll see the change in the next like 50 years. I hope that like these along with many other happening for other different reasons, whether it's, in all forms of politics. And I think finding ways to coalesce into, like, one of the kind of sidetracking, like this idea of scale, and scalability, and this, like, there was at one point, it's like, oh no, but we need to kind of, it's not about like taking over a park, you know, we need to go hack Wall Street, you know. And yeah, I as much as I want that to be like the scale of, to be able to scale up in a way that like is global, we need this like coalition building, you know. We need to kind of group in like these, like what I hope is that moments like this continue to happen in all sorts of disciplines, and I hope that eventually in like 50 to 100 to 200 years they will have another future that ideally is better than the one now.
Yeah, right. So I actually think that while we wouldn't be sitting here if we didn't have sort of a drop of it, like you said, because having conversations like this and even like, you know, good challenges and questions. But I also think that the job needs to be done regardless, right? So like, this is not related anecdote, but I went to a really interesting talk in Miami where one of the speakers at the end was talking about, you know, the impossibility of like Black bodies being, because like forever, because of the structural oppression of racism, right? And like this was somebody who really didn't believe like that there was something, but like his point was like, regardless, it's my job to like spell these things out, to just show you how shitty it is to like tell you all of these things. So I think that there's a place for both of those things. I don't think that we hold like a hopeless perspective on it, but and I think maybe the danger part of hope is in allowing yourself the disappointment of hope when something doesn't turn out the right way, right? So I think it's like about, and I think that's why I kind of think about like pessimism and optimism sort of like challenging and helping each other the entire time. Because every time you sort of like dip too high on your optimism and you're kind of hit and drop down, that pessimism is always also a very good driving force right back out of it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's sort of occupying a little bit of both. That sounds slippery, I know. I knew it was there. I was like, I know there was a ghost hand back there.
Structures, where it's atemporal is in the sense that the development is, you know, they've set out these 100-year plans, but the focus is always on the short-term benefit and not the long-term benefit. And it seems as though this idea of cachet, the term, you know, that faking it till you're making it, it's like there's this huge credibility gap that shows after a little time where, you know, they're pragmatists, so they don't have to worry about being pessimistic or whatever. And it seems maybe, I guess, a striking or a interesting thought, I guess, is having a strategy where you're looking at that credibility gap, that using one person's cachet as a way into creating these different forms. Could be at least different alternative institutional forms that, you know, you're not actually replicating, you're not using the exact tool, but you're seeing that form and working over through the craft, perhaps. I just thought the atemporal nature of that approach is interesting and surprising, especially in the sense of future mining.
Right. It's funny because by the time the reputation catches up to it, right, it's like already too late. You know, like, yeah, so it doesn't matter. It's like, that's why they don't worry about it, because it's just like, by the time they figure it out, it's like done. But it's also why like we don't pretend to recreate images on our own either, right? So like we're not going to go and pay the $120,000. We don't have it either. If anyone's questioning, like the $130,000, like, you know, the labor also is already there, right? There's a huge thing that we do, that we've been researching a lot too, is about the actual labor involved in producing these images, which is a whole industry on its own that comes from all over the world, that sort of implies its own levels of inequality, right? So like this is also kind of why we're like, you're right, existing in that gap sort of thing and trying to like scavenge from their dead images.
It's like we're zombies.
I know. My metaphors get worse and worse as the night goes on. Anyone else? That's it? All right.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your thoughts, you guys.